Hi, welcome to a new episode in the Internet Surfer, hosting the most horror and creepiest stories from Reddit. Please don't forget to comment, like, share, and subscribe. Enjoy.
I help people commit suicide, but they have to convince me to do it first. Long horror stories from Reddit. No sleep. Episode 3.
I have always been a fairly skeptical person myself, but I encounter such outlandish stories in my line of my work that my mostly logical way of thinking is frequently challenged. It's easy to write a great deal of these tales off as mental illness, but at the end of the day I'm left wondering if I'm simply trying to protect myself from things that very well may be true. This is one case that has stuck with me because I find myself believing it more often than not. Fair warning, there is some extremely graphic violence involving children in this one. This case will not be appropriate for all readers, don't say I didn't warn you. I met this woman about a year ago. She was a radiant woman with long red hair, probably in her early 30s. Her lengthy flowing skirt and abundance of bangles haphazardly thrown on her wrists gave off the impression of nonchalance, but I highly doubted that was the case seeing as she was at my door. She greeted me with a bright smile and immediately wandered in as if she felt welcome in my home already. "Feel free to take a seat on the couch and leave your things somewhere around there," I instructed, waving a hand in the general direction. The woman glided through the entryway as she shouted back, "Thanks, love. Nice place you have here." "Thank you, miss," I replied as we both took our seats. "Did you bring payment?" "Oh, yeah," the woman responded, momentarily frazzled. She hiked up her loose-fitting top and removed a stack of bills from the waistband on her skirt. "I had to sell my car for this, you know." I procured the payment with an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry about that, miss. Not like I'll be needing it now, though, right?" she joked, throwing her arms up and making a face. Her bangles jingled, making the motion almost pleasantly musical. The woman straightened her back and crossed her legs, folding her hands atop her knee. "I work security at a bougie hotel," she began. "I know, me, right? But really, all I do is sit around and watch cameras, call the police if anything seems off. It's a cushy job. I've never had any trouble, up until now." "What's causing you difficulty?" I questioned, still trying to visualize the slight woman as a security guard. She shook her head frantically for a moment, as if trying to expel an unsavory thought. "The hotel actually has a pretty dark history, though they have tried to shelter the public from that fact. It was previously an asylum for children. I have to admit, that is actually why I applied to work there. I have always felt a connection with the spiritual realm. As a young girl, I tried to contact my deceased mother many times," she mused. "I was hoping to see some spirits, maybe get some wisdom from the other side." "Have you seen any spirits?" I cautioned. The woman answered, "Yes, in fact I have. I was reviewing the security cameras on one terribly dull night when I noticed something strange in the basement. There was a man just standing there. He was facing into a corner, so I could only discern the back of him. But he just remained there, motionless. For hours," she proclaimed with a hearty laugh. I thought, this must really be a ghost, maybe one of the orderlies. I was overcome with excitement until he finally moved. Without turning his body, he reached one arm behind him. He stretched one finger out and, in the direction of the camera, beckoned to me, she explained, illustrating the gesture by using one hand to produce a come-hither motion. I nodded, urging her to continue. Then, I was scared. But I had been waiting for that moment for as long as I could remember. I put on my big girl pants and left the security room. As I descended the stairs, a man knocked into me as he hurried upwards. I was startled when I recognized that it was the man from the screen. I thought he couldn't possibly be a ghost because, as far as I'm aware, ghosts have no physical presence, she sighed. But if it wasn't him, I was going to figure out what was so damn interesting in that corner. Was there anything there? I asked. The woman nodded. Yes. I crept into the basement. I thought about flicking on the lights but didn't want to disturb whatever presence was down there. I marched over to that corner, prepared to meet a real spirit. She picked at a fingernail before adding, I was overwhelmed by that frigid feeling they always talk about in movies. I knew I wasn't alone. I whispered out a greeting to the ghost, not really expecting a reply. Did it say anything back? I wondered aloud. In the tiniest, sweetest voice, just, hello. It was a child, a young boy. I asked him to come closer so I could see him, but he told me he had a physical deformity that frightened people. His brother had it, too, and so his parents sent him to live in that forsaken place, she lamented. I reassured him that he could remain concealed in the dark for as long as he wanted, then I asked him why he still resided in the realm of the living. I heard him start to cry. I was overtaken with the desire to reach out and comfort the boy, but I contained myself. He explained that he could not move on until somebody understood what had happened to him. I gestured for her to resume her story. The woman exhaled a long sigh before continuing, I have always been extremely sympathetic to the strife of spirits who are not able to pass on, to be with their loved ones. I realized that I would have to be the one to hear what horrible things this poor boy endured. That man, he clearly couldn't take it. But I could. I asked him to share everything with me. What did he tell you? I probed, running a hand through my hair. Tears began to form in her eyes. The worst things you could imagine. His parents were repulsed by the sight of him and his brother, so they forced their children away. The doctors, if you could even call them that, vowed that they would make the children better. The boy spoke in a blunt, monotone voice while he detailed these atrocious crimes against humanity, she moaned, appearing to be in visible pain. Once they arrived, they were hosed down and starved for days. His only comfort was his brother, though he worried they would take him away. He told me that he would not be able to live without his brother. He said, I had his back, and he had mine, we could get through anything together, even that place. I sighed, already somewhat familiar with the horrendous conditions people in asylums were subjected to. Luckily, the boys remained together. Not so luckily, they were forced to undergo torturous therapies, she elaborated, air quoting the final word. He described, still in that steady pitch, that the doctors would take him and his brother downstairs to that very basement and put big metal spoons in their mouths. They'd feel pressure on the sides of their heads and then, everything would go blank. When he woke up, he couldn't even remember who he was.
I flinched at the thought of electroconvulsive therapy, how traumatic that must have been for the boy. Apparently, he reacted quite negatively to the so-called treatment, becoming violent in response. The doctors doubled down on the children, explaining that they would have to try more intense methods to cure them. He said, the doctors were going to make me better, and also help other people get better, too, she declared, tears starting to slip down her face. From there, it just got worse. The tales he told me, once, they opened his skull and inserted what I can only assume were electrodes into his brain. He explained, they poked me with something really sharp, it hurt me real bad, especially in my neck. Suddenly, my arms just shot out in front of me, I couldn't control them. My mouth started making this foamy stuff, then I just passed out. I chewed on my bottom lip in anticipation. She rested her forehead in the palm of one hand. He told me he was out for days after that. Another time, they must have injected him with needles full of something poisonous. He said, after the doctors gave me the get better shots, bubbles full of black stuff popped up all over my skin, she muttered. They swelled and burst, must have been extremely painful. That poor boy. She cradled her hand in her hands and cried for a few minutes. I sat in respectful silence, allowing her to express her misery. Finally, he described his death. The doctors dragged the boys kicking and screaming down to the basement. They strapped them to a cold metal table, she sobbed, shuddering visibly as if she was secured to the surface herself. They tied the proximal ends of his brother's arms off with tight ligatures. Without administering any anesthetic, a doctor sawed off his brother's arms, threw them in a bucket on the floor like garbage. The boy was forced to listen to his brother's screams and cries the whole while. My eyes widened in repulsion. The woman collected her tears on one sleeve before adding, after that, they repeated the process on both of his legs. The boy said, the arms were awful, but the legs, it hurt as if they were removing my own, even as I saw mine beneath me, she groaned. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't try. I always knew human experimentation occurred, but I never thought I'd meet someone who had been through such torture, she cried. Soon after that, the boy's brother died. The boy followed a few days after, developing a severe infection, chilling fever, sepsis, and finally the embrace of death. The woman sighed, sniffing. The boy had finished his story, and we lingered in silence for a few long moments. I asked him if his brother was down there, too. The boy laughed flatly. He said, of course he is, we are always together. He asked if I'd like to see them at that point. I skewed my head to one side, lifting an eyebrow. Did you? The woman nodded solemnly. I switched on the lights and I couldn't believe what I saw. This tiny boy, maybe 6 years at most, pale as a sheet. I asked where his brother was. The boy sluggishly turned around, revealing his brother, attached to his back, conjoined. Just a lifeless, rotted torso with a head that fell onto one shoulder. Whereas the boy was almost colorless, his brother was a sickly greenish color and bloated, with ragged wounds where limbs should have been. I exhaled heavily. Miss, I can't even begin to imagine what you've been through. She laughed through thick tears. The worst part is, that's not even why I'm here. I thought allowing this boy's voice to be heard would heal him, and I expressed this to him. I was so naive. The boy craned his neck up to meet my gaze with a cold, piercing stare. He said, you've heard my story, but you don't understand what I've been through. I want you to know the pain that I've suffered. I want you to feel it. I was overcome with a sudden dread, compelling me to depart the room immediately. I rushed up the stairs, eager to get away. Something tells me it wasn't that easy, I remarked. At first, I thought I was in the clear. But for the past couple weeks, I have been absolutely consumed by the compulsion to inflict harm on myself. The other day, I attempted to destroy one of my teeth with a pair of nail clippers. Even worse, I'm getting my boyfriend involved, too. I lost control last night and crushed up a bunch of sleeping pills, then slipped them into his coffee. Once he was out, I laid down beside him, overwhelmed with the uncontrollable urge to be close to him, she divulged, shuddering. I took a large needle and some twine, then started to stitch our naked bodies together at the waist. It hurt like a bitch, but it came with an inexplicable ecstasy. Luckily, I snapped out of it before he came to and released the sutures. But now he's asking questions that I have no reasonable or believable answer to. I have no ability to stop myself. I know it won't end, and I'm unsure of what will happen next time I lose myself. I leaned forward, clasping my hands together. Miss, please lie down. I'm going to prepare the injection. The woman followed my instructions, lying down in a smooth, fluid motion. After I have readied and returned with the needle, I tied off her arm to find a proper vein. Do you have any last words or wishes, miss? Please never attempt to contact the other side. They're not as friendly as you might think, the woman sighed before closing her eyes. This story continues to unsettle me, not merely because of its horrific content. It haunts me because I've heard it before. About a week before I killed this woman, a man came to me with this exact tale. He had lost his fingers to his garbage disposal by the time he was on my couch. For this reason, I take this woman's advice to heart.
Some of you have asked about younger clients, and I actually did see a fairly young man this week, probably in his early 20s. He brought me a pretty captivating tale, so I thought I would share it with you all. I am homesick in bed, so please forgive me if I sound a little off today. This will also likely be a shorter account, as I need to get some rest, but I need to get this story off my chest, first. When I let this man into my home, I observed that he was lanky and a little awkward in his mannerisms. I am actually this way myself, so I offered a genuine smile in response to his sheepish greeting. I allowed him to pass through the door, instructing him to take a seat on the couch. The man stalked through the entryway to the couch, tousling his greasy dark hair with one hand. He dropped a messenger bag on the floor by the couch and sunk into the cushions. I trailed after him, assuming my usual position in my chair to face him. I'm starting to feel a little ill today, so you'll have to forgive me if I sneeze or cough. Did you bring payment? Without a word, the young man shoved one hand into the outer pocket of his bag and recovered an envelope full of cash. He outstretched his arm, relinquishing the payment to me. I tucked the envelope into my coat. Thank you. You can start whenever you're ready. I've always been an awkward guy, he admitted, biting his lower lip. I'm not great with people, and I haven't accomplished much in my life. I know I'm young, but really, I lack social skills and motivation. I work a low-paying job, live in a crappy tiny house on the outskirts of town. It's an awful place, always falling apart, bugs, leaking, the lot of it. Of course, I can't afford to buy a house on my salary. I rent, and I have to share. I have a roommate. I nodded, understanding that most young individuals have to rent and share residences. He laughed, blushing. Of course, I think I chose the place because of this roommate. She was gorgeous, he mused, shaking his head. The kind of girl I always dreamed of dating but could never bring myself to talk to. I have low self-esteem. I couldn't imagine a girl like that wanting me. But I figured, probably naively, that maybe if I moved in with her, she would get to know me and fall for me. Did that work? I cautioned. You know? I actually thought it did, he sighed. A few months after I moved in, I went out of town to visit my parents for a few days. When I got back, I opened the door to our place to the most appetizing smell. I heard her humming, and I tracked the sound to the kitchen. And there she was, in the most beautiful dress, stirring a pot of stew. I muttered a greeting or something to not be creepy and alert her of my presence, and she spun to face me with this radiant grin on her face. She was so excited to see me that she threw her arms around me. She served me the most delicious home-cooked meal I'd ever eaten, and afterward she practically jumped my bones. I sneezed into a tissue. Excuse me, please continue. The young man pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose with a finger. The next few weeks were absolute bliss. I couldn't fathom how this goddess of a girl could be into a guy like me, he explained, laughing in spite of himself. She catered to my every need. Kept the house spotless. Fed me every night. Fucked me every night. I finally had the intimacy, both physical and emotional, that I had always craved. I told her everything, and she was always willing to listen. I thought, this is it. I've finally found the woman I can spend the rest of my life with. I'm guessing it changed after those first few weeks? I asked. Of course, all relationships change. I guess I didn't really know that for a fact, considering this was my first romantic relationship. But eventually she began behaving differently, he reflected. She kept the house in great condition, I never had to lift a finger. Even with all the labor she put in to maintain it, she couldn't change the general nature of the house. We got flies again, and a stench started to settle over the home. Probably some sort of mold, she said. I offered to take a look, but she wouldn't hear it. I wanted to fulfill that masculine handyman role, so I insisted. That was our first fight. She wouldn't let up, promising she would call the landlord herself. I gestured for him to continue. The young man shifted in his seat before continuing. I knew she was planning a trip to see her own folks later that week, so I waited. When she departed, I immediately set to work to locate the source of the bugs. The house I live in has a crawlspace, and it didn't take long for me to realize that it was coming from inside the walls. I groaned, thinking some animal had gotten in and died. He exhaled a long, deliberate breath before clarifying, "Something died in there, but it sure as shit wasn't an animal." I raised one eyebrow. What was it? It was my roommate. Once I got in the crawlspace, I was completely stunned to see the decaying, bloated corpse of my real roommate, he recalled, gazing down at his shoes. She was discolored and covered in flies. They crawled over eyes and into her mouth, fixed open in an expression of terror. Her throat had been slashed so deeply I could see bone, her head was almost severed entirely. The sudden cleanliness of the house made a lot more sense in that moment. I vomited right on the floor. My eyes widened. When I confronted my roommate, well, not my roommate, whatever that thing was, it was the most disturbing experience of my life, he breathed. I jammed my finger in its chest, screaming, "You're not her, you'll never be her, you stole her." It stared back in astonishment before cocking its head to one side and treading back slowly, in fear, I thought at first, he remarked with a short laugh. Before my eyes, its arms lengthened until they stretched to the floor, the unnatural growth accompanied by the sounds of bones and joints cracking. Then its legs grew, the creature's back arching, shoulders hunching. In contrast, its eyes shrank until they were only blackened pinpoints on its face. Its jaw made a sickening popping noise as it moved side to side before unhinging entirely, hanging and exposing the creature's gaping maw. It braced itself on its hands and feet, then it set after me. I felt my own jaw drop. The young man leaned forward as he continued, "It pursued me on all fours through the hallways of our home. I narrowly escaped, practically flying through the door and slamming it. I ran down the stairs, then down the street. I never looked back. Honestly, I don't think I would look back either," I reassured. "I can't imagine the horror you've been through." He locked his eyes on mine. "It was honestly terrifying, but that's not why I came to you today." I skewed my head to one side, coughing into one closed fist. "If not because of having to witness that, then why are you here?" "Because I found the corpse of my roommate 3 years ago. And the chase I just described, it only happened yesterday," he divulged, chewing on a fingernail. "Wait, what do you mean?" I urged. The young man shook his head in apparent shame as he began to sob. "When I discovered her body, a good man would have alerted the authorities, but I was not a good man. Instead, I purchased a saw and dismembered her. I cut her into tiny pieces, shoved them in tubs and covered her in acid. I dissolved her body and acted like nothing happened," he elaborated. "I was so desperate for love, acceptance, and, let's be honest, sex, that I continued the charade with this creature for 3 years. I put a ring on its finger and married it. I became a part of my deceased roommate's family. Her parents consider me their son, but in reality, I am just as responsible as this creature is for her death. I completely covered it up. There is nothing left of her anymore. And it took me this long to realize that I am guilty of this. I don't deserve to live." I nodded slowly in acknowledgement. "Please lie down, I'm going to prepare the injection." After I had finished readying the process, I offered my usual question. "Do you have any last words or wishes?" "If something seems too good to be true, it probably is," he stated solemnly, gazing up at me. "I'm sorry, this is probably really silly, but would you mind holding my hand as I go?" I did. I would like to extend my gratitude to all of you who wished me a speedy recovery from my illness last week. I am mostly healthy now, although still experiencing some residual fatigue. While I did not feel up to writing much while under the weather, I was able to dig through my notes to retrieve several interesting cases that I hope you all will enjoy. Today, I will share the case of a young woman from about 6 months ago. The woman, in her late 20s, appeared entirely disheveled upon first sight. Her eyes, swollen and red, showed that she had been crying recently. Her long blonde hair was tied back hastily, and she wore athleisure-style clothing. I allowed her to enter my home after we exchanged greetings. "Miss, if you want to take a seat on the couch and put your bag down, I'll be in right after you," I called down the hall. She threw a large bag down on one of the cushions and perched on the couch next to it. "I owe you money now, right?" "Yes, please," I confirmed, nodding. I found my usual spot while she rifled through her bag. Once she located and offered her payment, I pocketed it. "Feel free to start whenever you're ready." The woman hung her head before muttering, "Somebody, or rather, something took my baby." I stared in silence before offering sheepishly, "I am so sorry." She shook her head lightly. I've actually started to come to terms with that fact over the years. It's what I was left with that is the problem. "Pardon?" I questioned. "This is going to sound crazy," she warned. I smiled warmly. "I've heard it all, miss." "Okay," she replied, seemingly comforted by this. "Have you ever heard of changelings?" "If you're asking if I've seen that Angelina Jolie movie, the answer is no," I remarked, shrugging. The woman laughed once in reply. I hadn't either, until it happened to me. My boy, he was the sweetest, most beautiful boy. I am a single mom, so he was my whole world, the only thing I cared about. And he loved me too, so much. She began to cry as she reminisced on her past relationship with her son, what she had lost. He loved to play with me, always laughing and smiling. Until one day, when he was about 2 years old. When I came into his room that morning, the first thing I noticed was that the window was wide open. "Was your son still there?" I pressed, frowning at the thought of losing her child. She looked momentarily confused in how to respond. "Well, yes, but no. There was a boy there, but it wasn't my boy. He looked almost identical to him, but something seemed off. I tried to brush it off at first, but behaviorally, he had entirely changed." I cocked my head to one side. "Changed how?" "Well, he had acquired the normal abilities of his age at that point. He obviously wasn't giving speeches or anything, but he was talking. He lost all his words that day. More than that, it seemed like he lost his entire soul. He didn't smile anymore," she lamented, wiping her eyes on the corner of one sleeve. "That must have been really hard for you," I reassured, leaning forward. She nodded remorsefully. "It really was. I had no idea what to do, so I started researching online. And that's where I found out about the changeling. My suspicions only grew as I read. Things I had completely forgotten about checked out with the folklore. My boy was born with a caul, meaning he had this weird membrane covering his face at birth. Apparently, that is a sign that your child will be taken and replaced with a changeling, she explained, placing one hand over her face to illustrate this. I nodded, demonstrating my understanding. "What else?" "Beautiful children, especially those with blonde hair and blue or even silver eyes, are most likely to be snatched. And my boy, he was the most beautiful baby of them all, a real angel," she cried. And the descriptions of the changeling children, they were exactly like whatever creature I was left with. Wouldn't speak or smile, more irritable, didn't want to eat. It wouldn't even look at me. And it only got worse as time went on. "How so?" I inquired. She exhaled a long sigh before answering. "It would basically never speak, even though I knew it could. Sometimes, it would unexpectedly look at me and say, 'Mama.' And it would talk to itself when he thought I wasn't watching. Changelings act differently when they think they're alone, that's one of the signs." I raised one eyebrow, waiting for her to elaborate. "When it was alone, it would just sit there counting to itself, whatever it could. Changelings also like to count, One historical account I read said the changeling in question would obsessively count handfuls of seeds. And it would smile and laugh to itself, as if the company of mortals was not pleasant enough for it, she ranted. At this point, she seemed more angry than sad. Then, its behavior just became out of control. It took to hitting me, biting me, all that. I was covered in bruises for the better part of a year. I can't even begin to understand how tragic that must have been for you to go through as you missed your son, I remarked. The woman leaned forward, nodding. I realized that I had to get rid of it, to get my boy back, she responded, her voice hardening. I tried everything. Different salves, combinations of herbs and seeds. I even performed this ridiculous ritual where I took it to a dump and poured eggshells full of water over its head while screaming, "Take yours. Give mine back." Of course, that didn't work. My phone went off, a text message from my girlfriend. I apologized as I silenced my phone to hear the rest of her story. I'm ashamed to say, I took more forceful measures after I had exhausted all my other options, she cautioned. One text said I had to brutalize the child until it gave its true identity up. I did just that, whipping it fiercely for hours at a time. I scalded it with boiling water. I even put it in a low oven, raising the temperature just until its skin started to blister. I couldn't go through with that. What did you do, then? I urged. Tears formed in her eyes again. I caught it one day, humming a beautiful tune to itself. Changelings are known for their musical prowess. I just lost it. I ran downstairs to the fireplace and started the largest fire I could build. I carried it down there, screaming and crying and biting, and just threw it right in, she sobbed. When you burn a changeling in your fireplace, it is supposed to run up the chimney and return your child. That didn't happen, though, did it? I sighed, offering a sad look in an attempt to soothe her. She shook her head gravely. The thing just burnt up in the flames. Blistering, skin cracking, then charring completely. Its eyes just oozed. All the while it was screaming, "Mama, Mama, Mama." That is, until it died, she remarked through tears. None of it worked. I will never have my boy back. I can't live without him. Please, you have to help me, she begged, tears streaking her face as she gazed up at me. A long silence fell, broken only by the sounds of her choking and sobbing. I straightened my back in my chair. No. No? What do you mean, no? She replied, her confusion apparent. Miss, when I said I didn't know about the lore of the changeling, I have to admit I lied. I am sorry for misleading you, I began. I am actually incredibly well versed in the myth, and I understand that it has been used to justify the abuse and murder of children, especially autistic children. The woman leaned back in her own seat, wiping a long trail of snot along her sleeve. Well, I didn't know that. Well, here's what I know. I know that you lied just now. Your son was diagnosed with autism at age 2. You were well aware of the supports you should have given him, but failed to follow through on any of them. The police know that, too, I snapped. Now, this part is merely speculation, but I do believe it to be true. I don't think you believe any of this changeling stuff. You looked it up to rationalize murdering him because you were ashamed of him. She furrowed her brow. He shouldn't have been this way. I didn't even vaccinate him, for God's sake. How was I supposed to bring up a child who couldn't even talk to me? I exhaled in frustration. Listen, there was so much you could have done for him, and yet you made the wrong choice at every turn. You probably weren't expecting to meet an autistic person today, but, well, life has a funny way of giving you exactly what you need. And you probably didn't want this, but you needed to see that autistic people such as myself can live rich and fulfilling lives. Now you have to live with the understanding that your son could have, too. Her face contorted into an expression of rage as she rose up and pointed a finger directly at me. I'd rather him die than grow up to be a murderer like you, she shouted, grabbing her bag. Well, look at the pot calling the kettle black, I replied a bit too smugly. The woman spun around and stormed to the exit. I smiled to myself as I reread the message from my girlfriend confirming that she was waiting downstairs to apprehend her.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.